What if I told you the moment you feel most alone at night is not actually the moment you are weakest, but the moment something is trying hardest to silence your authority? Because 3 a.m. is not just a time on the clock. It becomes a battleground in the mind of the weary. And tonight, you are going to understand how that cycle breaks. If this message is speaking to you right now, don't just listen and move on. Across many prayer traditions and spiritual teachings, the idea of 3 a.m. being a pressure hour comes from the observation that the early morning period carries a unique psychological and environmental stillness that deeply affects human awareness. Around this time, external noise is minimal, social activity has ceased, and the body is often in its lightest sleep cycles or transitioning between deep rest and REM stages. Because of this, the mind becomes more sensitive to internal thoughts, memories, and emotions that are usually masked by daytime distractions. What people often describe as spiritual pressure at this hour can therefore be understood as an intensified form of mental clarity combined with emotional vulnerability. In many faith-based interpretations, this hour is also symbolically associated with transition, where darkness is at its peak just before dawn begins to approach. This symbolism has led various spiritual communities to treat it as a significant time for reflection, prayer, or inner struggle. When someone wakes during this period, especially repeatedly, the silence can feel heavier than usual, and thoughts may appear more forceful or persistent. This experience can create the impression of an unseen resistance, even though it is often amplified by the natural quietness and the brain's heightened introspective state. From a human experience perspective, stress, unresolved worries, or emotional burdens that are suppressed during the day tend to surface when external stimulation is removed. At night, especially in the early morning hours, the brain has fewer distractions to process, so it turns inward. This inward turn can feel overwhelming for some people, particularly if they are already dealing with anxiety, fatigue, or emotional strain. As a result, 3 a.m. becomes a symbolic marker for these inner battles rather than a cause of them. In prayer-based frameworks, this time is sometimes used intentionally for meditation or spiritual focus because the quiet environment allows for deep concentration. However, the same conditions that make it useful for reflection can also intensify fear or unease in those who are emotionally unsettled. The experience is therefore less about the clock itself and more about what the human mind does when everything else goes silent and unfiltered thoughts rise to the surface with unusual intensity. Fear often feels strongest not when something external is actually increasing, but when everything around a person becomes quiet enough for the mind to amplify what is already inside. In the absence of noise, distraction, and activity, the human brain naturally shifts its attention inward. During the day, thoughts are constantly interrupted by conversations, tasks, screens, and movement, which prevents any single fear from fully dominating attention. But when silence deepens, especially at night or in early morning hours, those interruptions disappear, and whatever was previously buried begins to rise with greater clarity and intensity. This is why fear can feel louder in silence. It is not necessarily growing in strength, it is simply no longer competing with external input. The mind begins to replay unresolved concerns, past experiences, and imagined scenarios. And because there is nothing else demanding focus, these internal signals feel amplified. A small worry that seemed manageable during the day can feel overwhelming in the quiet because the brain assigns it more attention and emotional weight. Silence also removes the sense of shared presence. When people are active and awake around us, there is an unconscious feeling of connection and safety. But in deep silence, especially when alone, that sense of shared human activity fades. The nervous system becomes more alert, interpreting the lack of sound as uncertainty. This heightened alertness can be mistaken for fear itself, when in reality it is the body's natural sensitivity to reduced environmental cues. Emotionally, silence creates a reflective space where suppressed thoughts gain access to awareness. Issues that were postponed, ignored, or emotionally managed during the day return without resistance. Because they arrive without gradual build-up, they can feel sudden and intense. The mind may interpret this intensity as danger, even though it is simply unprocessed thought becoming visible. In spiritual language, this experience is often described as inner warfare becoming more noticeable in stillness, not because the battle has increased, but because distractions that once concealed it have been removed. The silence does not generate fear, it reveals what was already present beneath activity, allowing internal patterns, anxieties, and unresolved emotions to surface with greater force and clarity that seems difficult to ignore or dismiss in the moment. Not every disturbance experienced at night or in moments of deep quiet comes from something physical or immediately visible. Human consciousness is layered, and when external stimulation decreases, the mind becomes more sensitive to its own internal activity. Thoughts that are usually filtered out during the day can surface more clearly at night, and when these thoughts carry emotional weight, they can feel unusually intense. This is often why people report a sense of presence, unease, or mental pressure during late hours, even when nothing external has changed in their environment. From a psychological standpoint, the brain does not fully switch off when we sleep or rest. It continues processing emotions, memories, and unresolved concerns. If a person is experiencing stress, anxiety, grief, or prolonged mental fatigue, these states do not disappear at night. Instead, they become more noticeable because there are fewer distractions competing for attention. The mind may reframe past experiences, replay conversations, or generate scenarios based on fear or uncertainty. When this happens in a quiet and dark environment, the experience can feel external, even though it originates internally. Fatigue also plays a major role in how these experiences are interpreted. When the body is tired, emotional regulation weakens. This means the brain becomes less effective at distinguishing between imagination, memory, and present reality. As a result, internal thoughts can feel more vivid, urgent, or even intrusive. This is why some people misinterpret nighttime mental activity as something beyond themselves, when in fact it is the natural outcome of a tired and highly sensitive nervous system. In spiritual language, these moments are often described as inner conflict becoming more noticeable when external distractions are removed. However, from a human experience perspective, it is often the mind attempting to process unresolved emotional material in the absence of daytime noise. The intensity comes not from something new entering the environment, but from what was already inside finally reaching the surface without interruption or suppression. What feels like an external disturbance is frequently the internal world becoming audible, and because it emerges in silence, it can seem unfamiliar or even overwhelming to the person experiencing it in real time without immediate context or grounding. Deliverance, in the practical sense of inner freedom, begins the moment a person stops interpreting their experience blindly and starts seeing it clearly for what it is. Awareness is the shift from reaction to understanding. When someone is caught in cycles of fear, anxiety, or emotional disturbance, the cycle often continues not because it is powerful in itself, but because it remains unidentified. What is not recognized tends to repeat because the mind cannot change what it refuses to acknowledge. Ignorance in this context does not mean lack of intelligence. It means lack of clarity about what is actually happening internally. A person may feel overwhelmed by thoughts, emotions, or recurring mental patterns and assume they are being controlled by them. That assumption itself strengthens the experience because the mind tends to follow the narrative it believes. When every thought is treated as truth and every feeling is treated as instruction, the inner world becomes chaotic and unstable. Awareness interrupts this cycle. It introduces observation instead of immediate reaction. Instead of saying, "This fear is who I am," awareness says, "This is fear arising within me." That small shift creates distance between identity and experience. And in that distance, choice becomes possible. A person can begin to question patterns rather than obey them, and that questioning is the first step toward breaking repetition. Many internal struggles persist simply because they are never examined. They are felt, reacted to, and endured, but not understood. Once awareness enters, the same experience that once felt overwhelming begins to lose its authority. It is still present, but it is no longer unquestioned. This is where change begins, not in the removal of experience, but in the reinterpretation of it. In reflective and spiritual frameworks, this is often described as light entering darkness, not because something external suddenly appears, but because perception becomes clearer. The same thoughts, the same emotions, and the same patterns are seen differently, and when something is seen clearly enough, it can no longer disguise itself as something greater than it is. Deliverance, then, is not always a dramatic event. It is often the quiet moment when a person realizes they are not trapped inside every thought they experience. That realization alone begins to loosen what repetition has held in place, allowing space for new responses, new choices, and a gradual breaking of internal cycles that once felt automatic and unchallenged in daily life. And awareness continues to grow steadily beyond confusion and fear. Patterns slowly lose dominance over time internally. Authority in prayer, in a practical and experiential sense, is the inner confidence and conviction that a person is not powerless in the face of their thoughts, emotions, or circumstances. It is not built on volume, emotion, or repetition, but on clarity of mind and steadiness of belief. When someone prays from a place of fear, their inner state often mirrors uncertainty, and that uncertainty weakens their sense of direction. But when prayer is grounded in conviction, it becomes a stabilizing force that reorganizes the internal experience of the person praying. Many struggles persist not because they are unstoppable, but because they are never directly confronted with intentional awareness. Emotional pain, anxious thoughts, or recurring mental cycles often continue when they are met with panic or avoidance. Authority in prayer changes this approach. Instead of reacting emotionally to what is felt, the individual begins to address it with intentional focus, choosing to speak, think, and align themselves with a different internal position rather than surrendering to the dominant feeling of the moment. This shift is important because the human mind is highly responsive to repeated internal direction. Whatever is consistently reinforced, whether fear or peace, tends to shape perception over time. When prayer becomes consistent and intentional, it begins to train the mind towards stability. It does not remove challenges instantly, but it changes the internal response to those challenges, which is where real transformation begins. Authority is also connected to identity. When a person begins to see themselves as capable of standing firm rather than being passively affected, their internal language changes. Instead of saying, "I am overwhelmed," they begin to shift toward, "I am not submitting to this pattern." This does not deny emotion, but it reframes the relationship with it. Over time, this reframing reduces the emotional control that repetitive thoughts once had. In this way, prayer becomes less about escaping experience and more about shaping it. It builds consistency in the inner world. where fear once operated automatically. And as this consistency grows, the person develops a stronger sense of internal order, where reactions become more intentional, thoughts become more examined, and emotional turbulence loses its ability to completely dictate perception or behavior in moments of pressure or uncertainty during quiet, reflective hours, especially when awareness is fully engaged and maintained over time consistently. Spiritual strongholds or recurring internal patterns rarely remain in place because of one intense moment. They persist because of repetition. The human mind is fundamentally shaped by what it practices consistently. Thoughts, emotional responses, and behavioral reactions become strengthened not by how dramatic they are, but by how often they are allowed to cycle without interruption. When a fear-based thought returns again and again and is not challenged, it gradually becomes familiar, and what is familiar begins to feel normal, even if it is unhealthy or limiting. This is why intensity alone is not enough to create lasting change. A single moment of emotional breakthrough can feel powerful, but if the underlying pattern is not addressed, the mind often returns to its previous default state. Repetition is what builds mental architecture. Every time a thought is repeated, it reinforces a pathway in the mind, making that response easier to access in the future. Over time, these pathways become automatic, and the person begins to react without conscious choice. Breaking such patterns requires a different kind of consistency. Instead of repeatedly feeding the same cycle, the mind must be gradually trained toward a new response. This involves deliberately interrupting old patterns when they arise and replacing them with new, more constructive ones. At first, this may feel unnatural because the brain prefers familiar routes. However, with repetition in a new direction, the old pathways weaken while new ones strengthen. In this process, persistence matters more than emotional intensity. Small, consistent acts of mental redirection have a deeper long-term impact than occasional strong efforts. Each time a person chooses a different response to a familiar thought, they are actively reshaping the internal structure that supports that thought. Over time, what once felt automatic begins to lose its dominance. In reflective and spiritual language, this is often understood as renewing the mind through continual practice rather than isolated effort. The shift does not happen all at once. It develops gradually as new patterns are repeated until they become stronger than the old ones. And as repetition builds in a new direction, the old cycle no longer has the same authority it once held, because the mind has learned a different route to follow when the same internal triggers appear again and again in moments of quiet awareness and reflection throughout daily life and night experiences consistently over time. Peace is often misunderstood as the absence of difficulty, noise, or emotional pressure, but in reality it is something far deeper and more stable than circumstances. True peace is not dependent on what is happening outside a person. It is the internal condition that remains steady even when external conditions are unstable. This means a person can be in a quiet environment and still feel disturbed, or in a chaotic environment and still remain centered. The difference lies not in the environment itself, but in the internal posture of the mind and heart. When people experience emotional or mental pressure, they often assume peace will come only when the pressure disappears. But this creates a dependency on external change. As long as peace is defined as everything being fine, it becomes fragile because life is never permanently free of challenges. In contrast, when peace is understood as internal stability, it becomes something that can exist alongside pressure rather than waiting for pressure to end. This kind of peace is built through mental discipline and emotional grounding. It develops when a person learns not to immediately surrender to every thought or feeling that arises. Instead of being carried away by internal turbulence, they begin to observe it, process it, and respond with greater awareness. Over time, this creates a steady internal anchor that is not easily shaken by sudden changes in mood, memory, or environment. In practical experience, peace begins to show itself when a person is no longer fully controlled by what they feel in the moment. Thoughts may still arise, emotions may still fluctuate, but there is a deeper awareness that remains constant beneath them. This awareness acts like a stabilizing center, allowing the person to experience life without being completely overwhelmed by it. From a reflective standpoint, peace can be understood as mastery over inner reactions rather than control over external events. It is the ability to remain composed within oneself while life continues to move unpredictably around them. And as this inner stability grows, situations that once caused disturbance begin to lose their influence because the mind has learned to remain grounded even when circumstances do not align with expectation or comfort, during moments of silence and reflection where awareness becomes more noticeable and present. Consistency in prayer, or consistent inner alignment through reflection and focused intention, is far more powerful than occasional emotional highs. Human transformation is not typically the result of one intense moment. It is the result of repeated direction. Just as a path in the ground is formed by constant walking rather than a single step, inner patterns are shaped by what is repeatedly practiced over time. When prayer or reflection is only occasional and driven by emotion, it often produces temporary relief, but not lasting restructuring of thought or behavior. Consistency works differently. It creates a rhythm in the mind. Each time a person returns to a centered state, whether through prayer, meditation, or intentional reflection, they reinforce a pattern of stability. At first, this may feel ordinary or even insignificant because the mind often expects dramatic change to validate progress. However, true change is usually subtle in the beginning. It shows up as slightly faster recovery from negative thoughts, slightly less intensity in emotional reactions, or a slightly clearer sense of direction in moments of confusion. Over time, these small shifts accumulate. The mind begins to default less to chaos and more to clarity. What once required great effort becomes more natural because repetition has trained the internal system to respond differently. This is how deep transformation occurs, not by forcing sudden change, but by gently reinforcing new responses until they become the brain's preferred pattern. Consistency also builds resilience. When challenges arise, a consistently trained mind does not collapse into panic as quickly because it has practiced returning to stability many times before. This repeated return creates familiarity with peace, and what becomes familiar becomes easier to access under pressure. In this way, stability is not something learned once, it is something strengthened continuously. From a reflective perspective, consistency is what turns belief into lived experience. It bridges the gap between intention and reality. Without it, insights remain ideas. With it, those same insights become part of a person's automatic way of thinking and responding. Over time, this shapes identity itself, because identity is formed not by what is occasionally believed, but by what is repeatedly practiced and reinforced in thought, speech, and internal response during everyday life and quiet moments of reflection when no external pressure is present. In conclusion, what we call midnight pressure or 3 a.m. battles is not simply about a time on the clock. It is about what becomes visible when everything else goes silent. In those quiet hours, the mind is no longer distracted, and what has been buried, ignored, or repeatedly reinforced begins to surface with greater intensity. But this experience is not meant to destroy a person. It is meant to reveal what has been operating beneath awareness. Fear feels stronger in silence, not because it grows, but because it is no longer hidden. Awareness is what begins the process of breaking that cycle, because once a person sees clearly what is happening within them, they are no longer blindly controlled by it. Authority is then formed, not through emotion, but through intentional response. When a person learns to redirect their inner dialogue instead of surrendering to it, they begin to regain control over patterns that once felt automatic. True breakthrough is not a single dramatic moment, but a process built through repetition. The mind changes through consistency, not intensity. Every repeated thought, every repeated reaction, and every repeated response either strengthens an old cycle or builds a new one. Over time, what is consistently practiced becomes what is naturally lived. Peace, in this understanding, is not the absence of struggle, but the presence of inner stability within it. It is the ability to remain grounded even when thoughts are loud, emotions are active, or circumstances are uncertain. This stability grows through discipline, reflection, and continual realignment of the inner world. And ultimately, transformation is not about escaping the night. It is about becoming unchanged by it. When awareness is strengthened, when responses are disciplined, and when consistency is maintained, even the most disturbing patterns lose their authority. What once felt like a place of fear becomes a place of clarity, where the mind is no longer overwhelmed by what arises within it, but instead learns to stand firm, observe clearly, and move forward with steadiness and control, regardless of the hour or the silence that surrounds it.